Hey y'all, climbing the labyrinth. This is one that has been a little too long in coming. If you've been following the podcast for a while, this will be hopefully helpful for those of you that are living in the Reformed Church in America world and the bubble of what next and what do we do, and is it the Alliance of Reformed Churches? Is it the CRC? Is it the PCA? Is it the who knows what else? And here's the reason for the video. For those of you that are local, that are a part of First Reformed here in Sioux Falls, the church that I pastor, we have a significant vote coming up on Sunday evening. If you are in the Midwest area or a part of some other churches that are having this conversation, hopefully this is info that will help you. Part of this is asking the question of what questions do people have? What are the questions? And that was what I did with the congregation that I'm at is what are the questions that you have as we approach this vote of to leave the RCA and move into the possibility of the ARC. And before I get into a whole lot of that stuff is I'll say one thing that is very important. Why have we gotten to this place so far and not heard, especially for my congregation? Why haven't I talked about this from the pulpit necessarily? And I will tell you the main reason for that is Sunday morning, the pulpit is for hearing God's word, whether that be read through the prophets, through the evangelists, throughout the biblical scriptures, or even the things that I would say that God would use. And so Sunday morning during sermon time necessarily is not the time to have the church question conversation, the denominational question conversation. Just because that's a convenient time for everybody else because you're already here doesn't mean that it is an appropriate time. Now, we have talked about a few things to say that there is conversation coming and a meeting coming, which is on Sunday, the 22nd at 6:30 p.m. But it isn't appropriate for me to use time that we would allocate in the service towards hearing God speak to say, Ken, what do you think about this? And the second part is I do not. So for everybody watching this, I hope this is helpful for you as a congregation, wherever you are, whether you're here in Sioux Falls with me or somewhere else. I hope this is helpful for you in making these decisions moving forward. Because for one, I am not a member of First Reformed Church. While I am the pastor here, I'm not a member here. And so it is an odd relationship within the way that our government structure works. But that means that in all likelihood, this church will outlast my time here, just like it has for the previous 4, 5, 6 pastors. And so the decisions made within the congregation, though, can be influenced by me, and I know that are directly influenced by me. I do not want to be the main voice that says, leave the RCA. I do not want to be the main voice that says, join the ARC, because that is a question that needs to be actually sifted through, and answers need to be sorted out, and conversation needs to happen, not because I drive that agenda, but because the people within the church and the leadership are driving that agenda. That is why I have stayed in the background for the most part. What I have done, which I think many people have found helpful, that I've heard actually all across kind of the bubble of the Reformed crew, whether that be people in Michigan or even people in the Midwest here, is I'll put, I think it'll be up here somewhere, maybe there, a bubble. And the bubble will come out and it'll say, here's a playlist. And this playlist will be things that I've discussed that are pertaining to, one, RCA stuff, whether that be some of the crazy things that I've noticed over the time here in the RCA, some things that denominationally have been going on, and then even some things that are ARC related. I have one in there that is the the line by line going through the organizational first paperwork of the ARC denomination, where I just go line by line of the things that they talk about, which if you watch some of those, especially those of you that don't know a lot about the ARC, if you watch some of those, I even have one that is with the two leaders of the ARC denomination talking about questions. And so if you watch some of those, that will help you before Sunday's meeting if you're local, or it will help you in general if you're having these conversations as a church. So just a reminder, make sure that you back up the video, you click on the bubble, and then it'll give you the playlist of all of them. You'll have to look through because some of them are RCA-specific things and some of them are ARC-specific things. But that will give you a lot more information than maybe what you had before. And here's the hard part that I've noticed is we live in a day and age and culture where most of us don't want to go out and find our own information. We want somebody to tell it to us. Or we've read it and we don't necessarily believe it or understand it or think that we understand it, when most of the time you probably do. So me pre-digesting some of that stuff for you may be helpful. The bubble was up here. Maybe I can get it to come up again. I'm not sure if it'll let me do it twice. But check that out. That'll give you some info. So where to dive in? What I did was asked for what are the questions that people have? What are the questions that you have? How can I answer them the most efficiently? And I will tell you first off, I did not spend hours and hours toiling over the answers to these. I took the questions and I am treating them as if they came live, as if we were in a meeting. And so I tend to think best on my feet most of the time and don't use a whole lot of notes when it comes to stuff. But if you see me looking up over this way, I have a screen that has the questions on it. And I'll tell you, I got a lot of questions. Lots and lots and lots of them were the same question, just kind of worded differently. So if I don't address your question specifically and you gave me one, it probably is correlated or related to one that somebody else answered. And the very first thing and the main thing that people are asking is, why are we even talking about leaving the RCA? Like, really? And some of that was along the lines of what's the primary reason for the RCA split. And I should point out that there is technically no split in the RCA. The RCA, Reformed Church in America, is the same denomination that it has been for the 400 almost years that it has been around. I think that's right. Ever since the sawmill in New York, New Amsterdam, New Netherlands. So as the settlers came across, they continue to do things. And the struggle here is we perceive a split that hasn't officially happened. So there isn't technically a fissure within the Reformed Church in America, but there is an unnamed one. And part of that, I will say, is regional, whether it be classes that are more on the coastlines or, although that's not entirely true, because Michigan tends to be kind of a hotbed for anything and everything these days, where you can get all varieties of opinions. But just addressing the split part is, we are not technically divided, but we are practically divided when it comes to what I would call the struggle of the historical conservative mindset and an approach towards the scripture, and then a more liberal progressive approach towards scripture. And that drives a lot of things. And so the conversation that's been had between many is, what's more important? Truth, that the Bible, the things that are true in the Bible are held on to, or the unity of the people that ascribe truth to the Bible. And so the oddity within this is, when you get to the more conservative side of things, the more historical approach is that holding on to specific truths and valuing the purity of the doctrine is the driving force that holds us together. When you get to more progressive side of things, then what you've seen, and what I've seen specifically, in General Synod and some meetings before in other General Synods that I've been a part of is the unity of us together trumps the purity of what the doctrine is. And so there's been this whole kind of unity, purity, and peace kind of jargon that's been used within the RCA for a lot of years. And one side says, no, it's the purity, and the other side says, no, it's the unity piece. And within them, there's really no way to bring it together. I think one of the conversations I had when I was a young leader, just kind of starting out the denomination, I got invited to do a leadership thing in San Francisco with the then Wes Granberg Michelson, who was the then general secretary of the denomination. And I asked him specifically, hey, we have this struggle. There's been kind of a looming struggle over women's ministry stuff. And then there is now, at that time, this would have been the mid-2000s or so, maybe like 2010-ish. There was a struggle then of what are we doing with the sexuality issue, and all of I don't think there are quite as many letters at that point. I think you were just lesbian, gay, homosexual, bisexual. All of the other things weren't quite as prominent. What are we doing with that? And his approach was to keep everybody in dialogue, and I pushed back a little bit and was like, what do you mean by that? And his thing was, for him as general secretary, was to keep everybody moving in the same direction, having a conversation, and that would keep the denomination together. That we have historical values that we ascribe to the denomination. We have stances on things that especially when it comes to sexuality and things, that many people would abide by and say, yes, we believe in those. And the struggle is continuing to have the conversation over whether we should change those or not, while not ever changing them on a paperwork level or a denominational level, where the struggle really is. And so here's where we get to the question of why are we really having this conversation? Is first and foremost is the struggle within how our denomination is structured. Now, what many people would want to say is, so we're leaving the RCA because of the sexuality issue. Or you get a good Midwestern guy, and I hear this through like the Midwestern farmer crew that maybe doesn't know the appropriate terms. And so is this about the gays? And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek because it's not like somebody's trying to be offensive. Most people just don't have the politically correct jargon, and sometimes politically correct jargon is not correct anyway. So here's what we're getting at is this about sexuality? And I would tell you, first and foremost, no, but secondarily, yes. So the true struggle is not about sexuality. The true struggle is about how our denomination is organized, and how we structure things as a governance sort of thing. But secondarily, the symptom of that problem is human sexuality within the denomination. And so let me lay this out. So we are a Presbyterian style denomination. So you actually have the Presbyterian Church. The difference mainly is a lot of the jargon for Presbyterianism came from the Scottish side of things historically versus the Dutch Netherlands kind of area where our denomination comes from. And think of it this way. So you have a local congregation where there are people in the congregation. And then you have elders and deacons, and those are your leaders. So, and they come together most of the time once a month. And those leaders come together and make a consistory or a leadership team or whatever your church calls that. And that group technically makes decisions for the church. We are not congregationalists where we're just a straight democracy, that no matter what we decide, it's always done through a vote, and whatever the majority of the people in the church want happens. What we do is Presbyterian-style governance within the Reformed Church says God uses leaders to lead people. Oftentimes, and you see this throughout the Old Testament, especially with Moses and the people in the wilderness, and then the judges, and on and on and on into the kings, and that God uses people to many times take the people of God where they wouldn't necessarily choose. And so we are not a democracy necessarily. We are representative, that God is being represented to the people through the leadership. Ministers are part of that leadership within the church. And so the minister, like myself, is not like the CEO, the one in charge of everything. Now, there may be pragmatic things from a structural standpoint of staffing that are different. But from a church governance standpoint, when the leaders meet together, the elders and the deacons and the ministers, that's the consistory. When you move forward, then you see that historically it's been just elders and ministers that form the classis. This is the group of churches that come together in a region or an affinity group. For us, it's Dakota, North and South Dakota. And so as we come together, some classes have allowed deacons, have said, hey, deacons should be a part of this too. And so when the classis comes together, it is those leaders from the local church that come to form the leadership of the grander church area, the regional area that is a classis. And you can see this representation of leadership moving forward. And then we have an intermediary that is called the Regional Synod, which is the group of all the classes. So all the groups for our area would be North and South Dakota is one classis, Minnesota is one classis, East Sioux and West Sioux in Iowa have a classis, the classes all over. And so as they come together in a larger region, there is for us, region of the Heartland, there's region of I think Albany, there's one in New York, one in the far west, one in the Great Lakes, Mid-Atlantic. There's a whole bunch of these that are just grouping areas that kind of form an intermediary, and they have a limited function within our church governance. But then as we move forward, the next major level is the General Synod. And so this is where big decisions are made for all of the denominations. So every classis, so Dakota, Minnesota, Illinois, all those different ones, comes together at the General Synod, and they have delegates that go there, depending on different factors. And so those delegates come to General Synod, and they vote on things, and this is what we get within our what's called the Book of Church Order and some of those things. Long story short, what typically happens is big changes get voted on at General Synod, and position and statement papers and stuff like that get voted on in General Synod. And if it's just a position, then it gets passed and it becomes a part of something separate that's not binding. And so we have positions within the Reformed Church in America on human sexuality. We have positions on gender. We have positions on, I think there's stuff on alcohol, euthanasia, abortion, all sorts of stuff that while they are a position within the denomination, they are not binding in any specific way because those positions are not in the Book of Church Order. That is the order book for each of the classes and congregations and regional synods. Long story short, what typically happens is things get voted on at General Synod and they get passed if they are generally the majority of the membership of the Reformed Church in America is conservative, or at least leans more conservative in their historical traditional value approach to Scripture. So General Synod votes on things and they generally pass most of the time towards a more conservative mindset. And what happens then is things that are of a large nature that would affect everyone have to be ratified by 2/3 of the classes. The struggle is that we have more classes that have lower numbers of people. The membership versus how many are in a classis is not always congruent. So we may vote on things at General Synod and they pass. When they go to a classis vote, then we have just enough classes that would lean more left or more progressive sociopolitically and theologically, that many times those things don't get ratified. And so what we have is kind of this stalemate of affirming decisions and making decisions but things don't ever officially get passed through. And I'll give you one example that is, I think I've given it before, about I went one year to General Synod, and the General Synod passed that marriage is between a man and a woman, and let's find a way to put that into our order within the Book of Church Order so it is binding on all congregations. And they referred that to the Judicial Order, Business, whatever committee. And the committee came back the next year, and then the next year I was a part of a committee that decides what goes on the floor of Classis. And their recommendation was the recommendation whatever last year asked us to work through an issue, and the answer we came back with was to propose that each congregation is allowed to choose marriage, all of the various issues between marriage within their congregation. So rather than what they were told to do was decide, and the General Synod decided, now make it happen that marriage is between a man and a woman, that's in the book, period. And the group came back and said, well, what we can do is we can't say that, but we can say that each congregation can choose what they want, which is the exact opposite of what they were told to do. Because if every congregation choose what they want, then those congregations that lean more progressive or more inclusive would then choose the opposite of what the General Synod instructed this committee to do. So those things never came to a vote officially for everyone. We get these weird kind of circles that stall out. So the struggle is latent within the system, and part of that is within the General Synod. The second part within that is that Dakota Classis here in South Dakota, if somebody in New York, New Jersey, Holland, Michigan, Zeeland Classis, I think there's a Classis in Florida now, or California, or wherever, can't decide to bring a charge against somebody else or another Classis. And so let's say we have a Classis that is not fulfilling what we believe is the biblical mandate of human sexuality. And I'm using that specifically because that's the main issue right now. There are other ones, but that's the main one. And so that's the symptom that we see is ordination and marriage of same-sex couples or actively practicing same-sex relationships that are being ordained, and various different levels of that. Now that we get into the different letters, that this is becoming a multiplicity of differences and things that can be construed in so many different ways. But let's just say that sexuality things are happening that are contrary to the doctrinal standards or the specific beliefs that we have as a denomination. We in Dakota can't say anything. Let's say it was in Minnesota or East Sioux or West Sioux or somewhere in Iowa. We can't say anything to them because they are their own Classis. They make the decision. Now, we can bring something up and say, hey, you need to address this. They can choose not to. So just like I can't go to a policeman from South Dakota can't go into Iowa and give you a ticket unless you come back to Iowa or Iowa says that they'll bring you back, that it works very similarly, that each Classis has its own governance within it, and another Classis can't come in and change things. Now, General Synod made a recommendation a number of years ago to open that up so that we could do that. And what happened was a lot of people said, yeah, we really like that, but what if it's an issue that we don't really like and it goes the other direction? So let's just not do that at all. And so everybody got cold feet, and here we are still left, the proverbial phrase of kicking the can. We are continuing to have the dialogue, which is continuing to cause fissure. So the main struggle is not human sexuality issues, LGBTQAI+, whatever you want to add in there. That's not the main issue. The main issue is that we can't hold anybody accountable outside of our own group. Just like I can't go and be the pastor of somebody else in another Reformed church in Sioux Falls because I'm the pastor here. An elder here is not an elder in another church unless that church allows them to have a voice as an elder within that church. Now, are they no less an elder? Yeah, they're no less an elder. They're still an elder within the RCA, but that doesn't mean that they have authority within that church specifically until it's granted to them. So as we come together, the struggle is the symptom of the struggle is sexuality stuff because it's the biggest hot button right now. A few decades ago, it was probably women's ministry, and before that, it could have been maybe the struggles between the RCA and the CRC stuff. I'm not really sure, but there's always something. There's always something that continues to push to the forefront, and the struggle here is nobody can do anything about it. And so, even if we say as a denomination we are these things, X, Y, Z. And somebody goes, well, I'm X, Y, but not Z. And they continue to move that way and continue to do things that are contrary to what everybody else feels and believes. Or let's just be flat out honest. When the majority of the RCA says marriage is between a man and a woman, period. And a number of Classis say, well, yeah, you say that, but we don't say that, and we're not going to have any issues with people doing marriages between same-sex couples. We can't do anything about that. And so what it does is it represents a whole different level to the rest of the world of who we are. For example, if you worked at Hy-Vee, they probably wouldn't like it if you came in wearing your Walmart t-shirt, but you said, so what are you going to do about it? It's kind of one of those sort of issues. I mean, that's really kind of petty and boiled down, but you get what I'm saying here. That is the main issue, is that there is no way to have conversation back and forth and hold anybody accountable. Because the majority of the denomination is pretty center to right of center when it comes to things, when it comes biblical theological approach. Now, as we move forward, then the question also came was, so why don't those progressive churches, why don't those progressive Classis, the ones that are outside of what we've said we are as a denomination, the ones specifically that are ordaining actively same-sex relationship people, or doing marriages or open and affirming and all of that stuff, why don't they just go? That is a good question. And I think the struggle is deeper than saying, why don't you go even though you don't line up with our values, that it becomes to them a justice issue. And what I mean by justice issue is they want to change everyone else, that they are open and affirming towards any relationship, and so the rest of the denomination should be too. It's not a, fine, we'll take our ball and go home. It's, we'll take the ball and continue to tell you that you're wrong and we're right, even though they're not in the majority. And so the underlying secondary problem has become many of the conservative voices and the conservative membership within the denomination are choosing to leave. This is one of the primary driving forces of why it's forcing people's hands and forcing Classis and congregations' hands is over at least the last 10 plus years that I've been kind of working within the denominational structure of things. You have seen more and more and more of the conservative group within the church just decide to go. They've just decided to leave. They've moved on to other denominations. And so that leaves us with a smaller group that holds to traditional biblical value and traditional biblical interpretation. And the group that does not is continuing to grow. And you may ask, well, why is it continuing to grow? And I think one of those things is a struggle that the RCA chose to do a number of years ago. And so right before I was a part of Dakota Classis or any of the conversation within ordination or any of those things, the RCA entered into what was called the Formulary of Agreement. This is between, at that time, I believe it was the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterian Church USA, PCUSA, not PCA, the UCC, United Church of Christ, and possibly the CRC. I don't know if they were officially a part of that or not, but eventually became a part of it. And so what it said was, your ministers can come to our congregations, and our ministers can go to your congregations. which seems okay, and that everything there is a reciprocity back and forth between us. The struggle that came was, one, the UCC is, while it has its early beginnings in German Reformed people rather than Dutch Reformed people, there's a whole history of the people that came over from German Reformed backgrounds said to the RCA folks in the United States, hey, we want to be a part of you. And they basically said, no, because you're not Dutch. I mean, the old saying, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, was totally true back then. And so the Reformed German immigrants that came over started the UCC, and they tended to be more congregational. And so each congregation chose what they wanted to do, and they were loosely affiliated. What that led to is many within the UCC denomination tend to lean far more liberal, progressive when it comes to biblical interpretation. And so they had a far more open door policy to a lot of the sexuality issues coming in. We saw this within the last few years within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I mean, just within the last 5 years or so, they had the big meeting up in Minneapolis where the storm came through and lightning struck one of the buildings that they were at. And I mean, you can't make some of this stuff up. But they've continued to move in a much more liberal, progressive area. And then the PCUSA has done the exact same. Like it begins with women's ministry issues and then moves into, well, then the next social bubble is sexuality issues in general over who you want to lay in bed with. And so those things move forward, and we see that other than the CRC, 3 of those groups within our Formula of Agreement have moved in a much more progressive fashion. And made it binding within their denominations. And so any of those ministers, and we even saw this, that some ministers that are in RCA churches actually got ordained in UCC churches so that they could have their ordination credentials, but then come in through almost a proverbial back door and become a part of the RCA system. Now, the CRC is an oddity because they are very similar to the RCA. Their governance structure is a little different, and I'm not 100% sure on how it all works, other than things tend to be a bit more congregational level rather than localized classis sort of level. And I know that they have significantly higher assessment dollars, so their taxation structure is a bit more than what the RCA sees from a pragmatic standpoint. And so they are actually struggling with the same things that the RCA is struggling with. They're just a few years behind us because they've kind of held the line a little bit longer, but they're beginning to see the same struggles. So then that's a good time to segue. One of the questions was, well, what about other denominations? If we say we should leave the RCA or at least be open to the possibility of leaving the RCA, then have we looked at other denominations? And the answer is, for those of us in Dakota Classis, there was a team within Dakota Classis that did that such thing. They looked at the CRC, they looked at the PCA, they looked at the Evangelical Covenant Order of Churches, ECHO, or they looked at like 10 or 12 other sort of denominations that seem to fit within a Reformed purview that would be akin to us. And every single one had its, well, that's good, but that's not quite us. And some of them were staunch on women's ministry issues, either in favor or opposed. And some of them just had stances that maybe didn't quite fit. One of them that would seem like the logical transition would be the CRC. And within that, it was the way that they do things governmentally is a bit different than how we are, and I don't know enough about it other than the team said, it probably wouldn't work real well, even though we have a number of yoked churches within Dakota Classis where they are RCA, CRC joined groups. I know here, and I said this earlier, a pragmatic thing is, and one of the appeals to the ARC is keeping more of your dollars home. So those of you that ascribe to a more conservative sort of government structure within the United States as far as taxation goes, keeping more of your dollars home so that you can do things with them. So your ministry is dictated by you as a church. What we want to do, more of our dollars goes to that rather than goes somewhere else and they choose what it goes to. Now, I don't know how the whole CRC structure works completely, other than there is a different sort of, I think the phrase is ethos. There's a different sort of feel with people within the CRC versus the RCA. And I can't speak to that specifically, other than from a historical standpoint. The RCA was Reformed Church in America since the beginning, so the 1600s. And the CRC was a denomination that came around later, that was a group that came from the Netherlands later on, I think in like the 17 and 1800s. And they joined with the RCA and said, hey, we're from the same place, let's do this together. And then some differences arose. The main difference, I think, that most people don't ascribe to, a lot of people point out the lodge membership and who goes to what schools, and do you have open communion or closed communion for your local congregation versus other people are able to come. I think one of the big main differences that doesn't get pointed out very often was there was a completely different atmosphere of the people. And so the majority of the RCA people were American Dutch. So they were American people. They were Americans before they were Dutch Americans. And so they came together, and yes, I mean, you see this all over. When people come to a new place, then you kind of gravitate towards the people that are more like you. And what happened was this second wave, the first wave of the Dutch that came over that started the RCA, or what would become the RCA, tended to be people that were displaced from the Netherlands, not necessarily people that actively chose to come to the United States, but it was kind of we don't have a whole lot of other options, let's go. Whereas the second wave tended to be a bit more affluent and a bit more theologically precise and a bit more articulate in some ways. Not that the first wave wasn't quite as much, but it was just a different group of people that came. And when they came, they were less Americanized than those that had been here longer. And so a lot of those values continued to move forward. And so what you had was the local crew of the RCA that was here for a long time that was a little more Americanized, and then you had the crew that had just come over from the Netherlands that eventually becomes the CRC that weren't quite as Americanized. And so you have two different subgroups of people coming together. And I think that was the bigger struggle rather than the particularities. And that still is today. I mean, you can drive into, I think it's like Edgerton, Minnesota, where there's a RCA church here and a CRC church there and an RCA church there and a CRC church there. There's multiples, and they're all different based on little subcultural things. Now, why doesn't that work for those of us in the RCA to go to the CRC? And I think some of it, I don't know the particularities, but I think some of it might be it's just a little too close to home. So maybe you have too many conversations in the past that maybe none of that stuff is valid, but it just isn't as easy a transition rather than starting something new. So something new is different than joining something else. And I think that's the main reason. Another question that was brought up was, what about General Synod in October? Like what's going on with the October meeting? Well, there was supposed to be a big meeting in 2020, and that didn't happen because, of course, the COVID came through and rocked everything. And then when you have a denomination that stretches across the whole United States, then you have areas in the United States where they're like, yeah, we can meet, we feel good about it, and then you have areas that don't feel as good about it. And so then suddenly it's like, how do you cater to everybody's kind of home base and still have a meeting? Well, you don't. And so it got postponed, and then the one that was supposed to happen at the beginning of the summer got postponed until October, and so they're hoping to gather, Delta variant craziness may abound, hoping to gather in October. Sorry, I'm just, it's all going to come back. Here's the reality. This is not supposed to be a COVID video, but we're going to have to deal with a whole lot of the same conversations we had last winter again. A lot of the things that are happening in the south of the United States are going to start happening in the north of the United States as soon as people come back inside. So people go inside in the south when it gets hot outside and they need air conditioning. People go inside in the north when it gets cold and you need the heat from the furnace. And what you do is recycle the same air and you're in closer proximity with people. So everything that's happening in the south is going to happen in the north again. Now let's hope that Arizona gets all of their Delta variant done with and we can actually meet. But the conversation there is there are a number of recommendations coming from the 2020 team. That one was like a mission agency and another one was how to explore diversifying the RCA, basically two different groups under one umbrella. And the third one, which I read some of the newest report that came out recently, was what does it mean to have grace-filled separation? And so they're giving some particularities to how do we actually conduct these meetings for churches to leave the RCA. And I'll just reaffirm that the progressive churches probably are not going to leave the RCA. History aside, I mean, most of them actually are in more historical areas, and so they have a lot more. While we in the Midwest may say, "Oh, we're RCA through and through," some of the churches in the RCA on the East Coast have been around longer than our families have had farms in the Midwest. So keep that in mind. Like, they have a history that's much longer and richer than ours, though it has strayed from what we think is the conservative value. They still have the same feelings, and so many aren't going to leave. And the struggle here is, well, why don't we just wait until General Synod comes in October, and then we see what happens, and then we can move on from there? Why are we having these conversations now? Well, for one, best case scenario, something gets voted on and approved at the General Synod. Let's say the grace-filled separation gets approved and the amendments don't get too crazy, and what we read in their report, the recent report of the particularities of how assessment structures would work when you leave and how long you pay and some of that stuff all gets worked out in a really good way. Let's say the best possible outcome happens. It still has to be ratified by 2/3 of the Classis. Well, that tends to be a problem. So you would have something that would get voted on in October and then not actually come to the floor of General Synod again until next year in June, saying that they meet in June. And then it has to be approved again. And so it has to be approved, ratified by the Classis, and approved again, I believe, at least once, by the General Synod in order to take effect. So we are talking a multiplicity of years before things can actually begin to happen. I think what will happen in the meantime is the denomination, as has been the trend, will continue to hemorrhage. It will continue to bleed out those that are more like-minded with many of us in the Midwest. And so those of us that have a traditional biblical value will continue to see more and more people leave because they've been fighting for a long time. And now most people in our congregations, most of you watching this, maybe have no idea how long these conversations have been going on. A very long time. And so some people are sick of having it and go, okay, fine, I'm going to take my ball and go home. I mean, we're seeing churches that are deciding to go. And specifically for us in the Dakotas, Dakota Classis, the leaders of all those churches met together and said, the only option that's good for us is option 3. And now that it's been so many years, Dakota Classis as a whole, pretty much all the churches, by and large, I mean, there are a few kind of outliers. By and large, I would say 90% of the congregations in Dakota Classis are choosing to leave now. Are calling the bluff of so many in the RCA denominational structures that the phrase was, oh, they're just saber rattling. And now I think that goes back to the old way of when you have two armies against each other and you bang your swords together so that it makes it sound like you're really serious and you yell and you scream, but nothing ever really happens. And so all the leaders, the elders and deacons and ministers in Dakota Classis that met for the last few years said, hey, let's do something. We're done of being told you're not going to do anything. You're just talking real loud. It's all game. It's all fluff. And so now it's really coming down to it. And so I think 30 some churches are scheduling meetings like we're having on Sunday to have the vote. I mean, this is the reality that it's come to. Eventually you reach an impasse, which is not necessarily unbiblical, which I will actually appeal to on Sunday. You see the struggle between Paul and Barnabas and John Mark. That sometimes it's okay to part ways. And what I will say, too, is from a denominational standpoint is generally what has happened, as you've seen throughout the course of history within the church, is the more conservative faction tends to veer and start something new. That rarely is there an internal reformation that happens, but the reformation sparks something new. And the new tends to be the one that is more, let's go back to the Bible. Let's go back to the original interpretation and not embrace a more localized socio-political liberal sort of perspective. So the new isn't necessarily the old, which is the oddity. The new thing is usually the one that has been around longer ideologically or pragmatically, but they just carry on a new name. Let's see here. Oh, one of the questions was, so why do any denomination at all? Why? So let's say First Reformed Church votes and says, yeah, we're done with the RCA. We've had enough. Why would we go to any denomination? And one, here's the most overarching and glaring issue is the Book of Church Order that we're a part of says that you can't just leave to nothing. You have to go to another denomination. That you must go to another denomination is, I think it's shall or must within the BCO. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but you can't just choose to go and do your own thing. The loophole in that is that the local classis would have to enforce something against you and say that you couldn't just go and do your own thing. But the secondary thing and the more real thing rather than just the stuff on paper is you go to be a part of a community. Why don't we just sit at home and have our Bibles ourselves and have no time to gather together? We don't do that. We want to gather together. Why do you think we went through so many leaps and bounds to help continue some sort of community, even virtual community over the last year and a half with COVID stuff? God's people are meant to be together in community. And so what we see is for example, in talking with our Classis minister, Seth, let's say a church says, well, we just want to go on our own, non-denominational, we're good. And so they do that. Well, then what happens when they're like, we're having really trouble or a really hard time finding a pastor? Do you think you could help us? No. I mean, Seth would probably not actually say no, but he should. Because when you choose to leave a fellowship and not be a part of them and not go to something else, then you're choosing to be on your own. Like, this is the reason that many, 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 many people don't choose to go into entrepreneurial business for themselves, because they like the comfort of having other people and a larger overarching group with them, helping them move forward. So same thing in ministry. You could be a missionary on your own and just move to anywhere you wanted and try and propagate the gospel and try to build relationships and do all that stuff. You could totally do that. But what would happen if you needed help? What if you were a person that said, I'm going to go to Afghanistan 5 years ago, and you start developing relationships all on your own, and you had no mission agency whatsoever, and now Afghanistan is in utter chaos? Well, this is a bit political, but it seems that the American government doesn't seem to be helping anybody get out of there other than Afghanis. So that's a problem. But you would want your group to be with you, to help you when you need it. Now, many churches don't need a whole lot of help, but when you do, the point is that you get that from those around you, or you can give that help, aid, assistance, community, encouragement, edification to those around you when they need it. So it is a unifying thing. It's better to be a part of something than to be a part of nothing and completely on your own. I even saw this in the days of when my gramps got too old to actually harvest all of his stuff on the farm. He had long given up animals, but he was still farming all of his land, and it came time for harvest, and he couldn't do it all. And so the local crew, I think it was the Daniels family and the Denicus family and all these families would come together and help out this little old man that was still doing his thing. Like, that's what we want, is to be a part of something. Why, and this is a good segue, why would we choose the ARC, Alliance of Reformed Churches? I'll point you back again if you didn't click on the bubble earlier. The ARC, I did the interview with Tim and Dan, which we'll hopefully do another one in the near future. And I did the one where I went through their organizational document specifically that gives, here are the things that we're for, here are the things we're going to do moving forward. And you can go back and listen through that one, because this video is already getting too long. But why choose the ARC? And I think a very simple answer is the ARC is the outgrowth of those conservative churches, those center to right churches throughout the United States. There was a group in Zeeland, Michigan, and there was a group that was in the kind of Denver and the far west that were basically saying, hey, we've had enough. We've had enough of fighting over these things that are not fruitful in ministry. Let's get back to this purity standpoint and be together, and so that we can actually be unified in ministry and not argue over the same things year after year after year. And so that group came together, and Dakota Classis kind of came alongside, and some of its leaders. And what happened was, it was kind of a logical, practical progression of, rather than every single church that was fed up, every single Classis that was fed up of the things going on over the last few years just kind of went their own way, they all came together and said, maybe together is better for all of us. Is there something we can do together to kind of form something new that is still familiar to many of us? So these are people that we know. These are our proverbial sons and daughters of our congregations growing up. These are the product of covenant theology. Many have been baptized within Reformed churches and have had kids and are now come full circle to lead the next generation within those things. And so we see that happening. Some pragmatic things is, the reason for the ARC was, after going through a lot of the conversations with other denominations and them not quite fitting, the ARC, and I'll point you back, look at the organizational document one. They ascribe to the same Reformed convictions, and they have more localized and specific board for ministry ordination things, so that it's not every single group kind of chooses what they want. And in some ways, it's not fully Presbyterian anymore. And so now the way that the ARC functions, and this kind of changes bit by bit and gets a little more nuanced as things progress, because this is brand new, is that there will be a board that oversees things, and that board will be made up of the local networks. So what we think of as a Classis now, I think it's like 30 to 60 churches will be a network or something along those lines, will then have people from that network on the board that oversee the denomination. And then there is a back and forth that happens of making decisions between those local networks and the congregations within the networks, and within those ministers that are a part of it, and not so much we got to go to a big meeting and take a vote, and then we got to send the vote out to a whole bunch of people and those classes, and then we got to see it come back, and then we got to take another vote. That stuff isn't going to happen. So it's a much leaner organizational structure. And you can go to arc21.org, arc21.org, and I believe Dan has put out a series of maybe 2 or 3 articles where he talks about this different structure within the governance. So you can look at that. The secondary thing is the ARC said that we would be open to your local congregation choosing women in ministry, because the pragmatic thing is every congregation chooses on their own anyway, whether they outright say it or don't say it. And they said, we see that there are those that use role-based leadership where God gives specific roles. And then you also see within the New Testament gift-based leadership, people that have specific gifts to do things. How your church chooses to approach that is entirely up to your church. And when we gather together, we will have the unity to say, hey, we're not going to make that the issue, that is a secondary doctrine issue. That is not about Jesus specifically. That is about you and your church's approach. So that was an appealing thing versus like the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, which I believe is no women in ministry, or at least no female lead pastors or something of that effect. One of the other questions was, will the ARC dictate things as far as worship styles and educational programs and have a suggested order for things? And at this point, I would assume that they will not have specific dictates other than things that are agreed upon. And so like the RCA has a worship liturgy book, they may have something similar to that, although it seems to be a more autonomous structure of networks, and churches can choose those things. And so it's not like they would tell you, you must do certain things within your worship service. Nothing that would be outside of what we already have. So I don't foresee any of those things happening. One of the other questions was, will there be an orange book still followed within the ARC? The orange book is the book of church order. And I would say there would be something, probably a leaner version, but some of that is going to be different because we won't have regional synod or general synod in the same way that the RCA does. And so some of those things will be applicable and some of them will not. What about if future problems arise? So like the struggle that we have between one classis and another classis, or groups that are not being held accountable when they don't follow through in the things that we say that we believe as a denomination. That I have heard from that will take place within the networks and within the structure of the board, where there will be some back and forth. Part of this actually that is real new is that there is a covenant renewal within this. And so I believe it's 5 years, each church would have to say, yes, we're still in. So you go in at the beginning, you say, we're ARC, and 5 years comes around and you go, you know what, you guys went in a total different direction than what we're comfortable with. The board has said, that's fine. You go. We don't want you to stay here if you don't want to be a part of this. But it's not the same as saying, it doesn't begin with, we have to change things to make everybody else see the ways that the things that we think. You have every opportunity to step back. And that goes for ministers too. So one of the ironies is the ARC is preparing to take in congregations, but has not worked through what it means to take ministers. So even if the majority of classes or churches say that they'll go ARC, that doesn't mean that their pastors and ministers can actually go ARC yet, because they haven't worked out the full details of that. So it'll still be a yoked relationship between the RCA for quite some time yet. And some of that is completely fine, because we need to agree to pay some assessments to help further ministry within the RCA, because of assessment stuff is done retroactive, and so you don't pay for it. You don't pay things as you go along. It comes after the fact, kind of like how we do taxes in the United States too. It's afterwards. I should say part of that too is people have asked, well, what about the missionaries? Well, the big thing with the missionaries is missionaries within the RCA are not funded specifically through the budget of the General Synod of the RCA. They're funded through partner and mission shares. And so if you have a congregation that you have specific ministries and missionaries that you want to continue to have a relationship with, do that. And you're encouraged to. You should have a good enough relationship with those ministries and those missionaries that you know where they're at, what they're believing, and whether you guys are on the same page or not. So continuing to do those things should have no impact whatsoever, whether you choose to go RCA, ARC, any of that. And others have asked the question of well, what's going to happen with like Inspiration Hills and stuff. And one of the things I can't say is I don't know. I don't work with Inspiration Hills. It is a collaboration between the local Classis in the area. I think it's Minnesota, South Dakota, and 2 of the Iowa ones possibly. And so some of that is that ownership is held in unity together. So they'll have to make decisions. But from a very practical standpoint, that doesn't mean that you can't still do things as a church with them. That doesn't mean that you specifically as an individual can't send your kids there or can't volunteer there or can't go there for other things. You can do that. We could give money to them anytime we wanted, even though they really came out with a huge debt-free thing, which is awesome. Some of our churches probably need to take a wink and a nod from that and start whittling away at their own debt. Will the ARC be only RCA churches? And that is one of the things that has surprised me. I'm going to look down here a second. Tim Vink put out a 3-month update. If you go to arc21.org, you can see one of the recent updates. And this is an update where all 8 regional synods within the RCA have leaders that are exploring the ARC denomination. And then within that, you see churches and leaders within the CRC, the Presbyterian Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church of America, and other independent congregations. These groups could be anywhere from 50 to 250 churches that are exploring and having conversations with the ARC leadership. 40 churches are already in process to transfer to the ARC. Let's see here. And now they are working on teams between the House of Prayer, ordination team, finance, and network design stuff. But one of the things to hear in there is it's not just RCA. It is... I hope that recorded. Some of these things aren't necessarily recording all of a sudden. Let me pause and check. Okay, hopefully I'm back. I hope this worked. I think I talked too long for my computer. So one of the big things that has been interesting is the ARC is now broadening out to not just RCA congregations and RCA leaders, but it is incorporating groups from the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the Presbyterian Church in America, not the PCUSA, although maybe some, but the PCA, the more conservative one. Some CRC congregations, that it is not just RCA that is coming in, but it is a group of many more that will be gathered together underneath the same sort of ideas and values that you can look at. Please go back, click on the bubble that gives you the ARC organizational document, or you can go to arc21.org and get more info. And that's for you. You have to look at those things. I'm not going to be able to digest everything for everybody, or this video is going to get to be like 3 hours long. Let's see here. One of the other questions was, so why now? Why not just wait and see if the RCA changes course? And this tends to be a more Midwestern mindset that maybe if we wait, things will get better. And most of the time that doesn't happen. That think about the last time that you talked to your dad and he goes, well, my knee kind of bugs me. And you go, well, you should go in and get it checked out. And they don't ever go in. And they don't ever go in. And they don't ever go in. Because any sort of conflict or struggle or change is far scarier than continuing on in the same dysfunction. And so will things probably change in the RCA? Very unlikely. In the meantime, many of the churches that we would find to be like-minded will continue to leave. And then, especially within Dakota, the majority of the churches within Dakota have actually already gone. They've already petitioned to leave the RCA and are now waiting for the classis to act on that. So the struggle in that is eventually you get left behind. And that's not what anybody wants to do. I would hope not. I would hope that we would have courage to move forward and not be the ones that say, and I don't mean this is derogatorily, but it does have a similar connotation to the people in the wilderness that Moses marches them to the promised land and Caleb and Joshua go in and they say, we can take it, but there's some pretty scary things ahead. And the people go, oh, we're not going to do it. It's too scary. You know what? A lot of things are scary. A whole lot of things. Will the majority of these things denominationally change the way that your church localized looks, feels, acts? Very unlikely on a day-to-day level. Very unlikely. Now, will you possibly see more dollars, resources, or connections with other ministries in your area if you choose them? Localized? Yes. I think just from a budgeting standpoint, the last time I saw the Dakota Classis budget, that more than half of your assessment dollars, so within Dakota Classis, you pay $100 and some per member, per active member within your church. More than half of that went to Regional Synod and General Synod. Now imagine what you could do ministry-wise if you got $50 some back for every single person in your church. If you have a pretty big church, that's a big chunk of money. What could you do with that? How could you dream and actually use that local or tangibly so that you can see life change in the people within your congregation and in the people in your area, or give that specifically to ministries, give that to missionaries that you choose, rather than sending it off for the struggle of bureaucracy and keeping the machine going. I mean, that's a pragmatic thing that I think is helpful for those of us frugally minded folk. And maybe just kind of a quick recap of so what are some main reasons? Like, what are some main reasons to say, you know, RCA, it's been great. We still hold a common history and heritage, but moving together in ministry forward is going to be a real struggle. Like, why would we choose to vote no to the RCA and yes to the ARC? I think very, very, very rationally at this point that the RCA has, for those of us in the Midwest, and I mean this in an inclusive way, of those of us that have a traditional biblical value, that look at the scriptures and read it for what it says and don't make a whole bunch of hula hoop jumps around, that are those of us that are not swayed by more of a social justice, maybe even wokeism within the church. The RCA has left you a long time ago. So if you're at all middle to right conservative, the RCA has been leaving you for decades, and you've just not noticed it because either you live in the Midwest and you choose not to interact with some of those things, or you just don't know where to look. So if you look at some of those playlists, or that playlist earlier where I have some of the things that are going on in the RCA within the last couple of years, even some of the things that Eddie has said, you should be a bit appalled. And so they've been leaving you for a very long time. The vows that I took at my ordination are not the same that you would take now. The things that I agreed to be a part of are not the same things that are now a part of the RCA. And so it left you behind is the first kind of struggle. And along with that goes the reinterpreting of biblical authority. So we all have biblical authority. We all give the Bible authority within our lives. But where that hierarchy is changes. For many of us, we say the Bible is the ultimate authority, and then we shape our life based on that. The Bible says don't do that, and so we don't. It says do these things, and so we try to do them. We do the best that we can. 1 Corinthians, Paul says that there's only one foundation, that's Christ. 1 Corinthians 3. There's only one foundation, that's Christ, and we all build from that foundation. Some with gold, some with bricks, some with straw, some with chaff, some with, and the fire comes, and in the end, your works, the things that you've done, will be shown. So does that question whether you still have the foundation? No, you're still a part of God's family. But where you are in that, the rewards that come, Paul says, will be based on what withstands the fire of God's refinement. And so I tend to go on the side of saying that the historical approach to the Bible is the one that we should adhere to. Many within the RCA, it seems, are continually being lured away by social media, by mainstream media, by things on the internet, by all of the different censorship stuff, by all the things in the church that continually tell you to reshape how you think about the Bible based on your modern or postmodern mindset, by the lens that you live, that you should read the Bible through the lens of your social media and media stuff rather than read the Bible and let that apply to your lives. That is the continuing trend that I've seen in the RCA, which is a big struggle for me personally. And with that is the then turning your back or the well, you just don't get it then. That if you hold a historical conservative value to things, then, well, you're just old-fashioned, or you're not smart enough, or and these are kind of gross characterizations. I'm trying not to make a straw man out of this, but there is a look down uponness that happens, that for me specifically, shame on me for being a man, shame on me for being a white man, shame on me for being a more alpha male type person. I should be far more effeminate, that all of those things are now looked down upon rather than saying, God created me to be me. That within our structures in our churches, that many of those things are being looked down upon as not who God wanted you to be or created you to be or empowered you to work towards, that they're basically put in that place of, well, you just don't get it. You just don't get it. And that's a pretty rough spot to be. And maybe another one that's kind of related is that we see, especially within you see within Corinthians the struggle. You see within Acts of Paul and Barnabas and John Mark parting ways. You see very, very explicitly within the book of 1 John and 2nd, 3rd John that John's epistles, he's very explicit that if you don't adhere to the doctrines that the church says these are who we are, and you continue to push a localized kind of syncretized religious state that makes God into be a liar, then you got to go. And so from a biblical standpoint, God says purity is pretty darn important. I mean, there are a number of times within church history where the big struggle was, is Jesus a God? Or was he just a man that God did something to? Well, that was something that people fought about. And some people were out and some people were in. And then there was the struggle, well, so is there a Trinity or is there not a Trinity? And these are things that we adhere to. And as you move forward, then you begin to see more and more and more come in that it's some of the same conversations, but the idea that the church is continually moving forward, and you will always have to say those things are not true. Those things are not biblical. And it is okay and kind of your mandate to do so. Oh, goodness, we're at like an hour and 15 minutes. That hopefully helps. That was a lot of stuff to kind of digest. Hopefully I can piece it together and the audio and stuff works out. If you're at First Reformed, hopefully you made it this far. Make sure you look at some of the other videos. If you have questions, make sure that you read some of the stuff that's on arc21.org. That come informed and yeah, I think we've climbed the labyrinth a little bit, even though it gets a little more confusing as we move forward. That I hope that this information has been helpful to you, and you will always get a little bit of my own personal ramblings that happen in the midst there, but that's what happens. So, till next time, y'all.